Okay, this is an example of what our app is going to do. We're going to have a bitmap image that is going to react to accelerometer sensors, and it's going to move the image across the screen as the device is moved back and forth. And so that's why it's kind of shaky, because I'm having to move it back and forth, and there's no way to demonstrate this on the emulator. So this is what we're going to end up with by the end of this project. Okay, in this video demonstration, we're going to look at how to use the accelerometer in order to move an image across the screen. So I've created a new project just called Skater because I have a skateboarder image, and I've set it up for Android 2.3.3, and I've added a ping image of a little skateboarder that we'll use. Nothing else has been done to the project, so I can open up my main Java and we just have the default main activity set up. So I'm going to create a new class, and in that class we're going to use that in order to display our skateboarder onto the canvas. So I'm going to create a new class Draw Skater, and it's going to extend, instead of activity, we're going to have it extend view. So I'm going to choose view and finish. Okay, so now I have a new class called Draw Skater, and it extends view, and we can see that right away we have an error that's being flagged, and so we need to add the constructor Draw Skater for context. So we'll have it automatically add that in for us. All right, now to get a reference back to this class in our main Java file, I'm going to come back in here, and so we can say the name of our class, Draw Skater, and we're going to we'll call it our skater. So we can now reference the information from this class through our skater. And instead of using our main XML layout, we're going to change that up a little bit. We're not even going to use our main XML for any of the layout on this. So we're going to come in here and say our skater is equal to a new Draw Skater class, and we're going to pass in the reference or the context of this. And then we'll say, we'll set our content view instead of our layout main. We're going to say it's our skater. So next we can go into Draw Skater, and where we have our context, we're going to be able to, well, let's add a variable up here for a bitmap image, right? So we have our skater that we want to be able to add. So I'm going to say this is bitmap, and I'm going to call my graphic Betty. So we have skateboarding Betty, and I have to import in bitmap and get rid of this stub. And now we'll define the image in here. So I'm going to say Betty is equal to, this is bitmap factory, and we're going to decode resource and get that from our drawable folder. So we'll have decode resource, and we're going to say get resources, and the resource is in the R drawable, and here's our Betty skateboard image. So now we've defined our variable for our image that we want to be able to draw onto the screen. So this constructor will allow us to be able to share this information back between our main Java where we created this. So this is actually representing the information and the data that's within our constructor. And our constructor, you can see here, has the context, and we use the same name as the class name when we create a constructor. So this will allow us to share information between, or pass information with context between classes. Now to draw our skater onto our screen, we're going to use the Ondraw method, and that is a method that's already available because we are extending the view. So I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to right click and get to source, and then from source there's override implement methods. And you can see here that since I'm extending the view, these are methods that I can override or implement. And I'm going to scroll down and look for Ondraw, right? And here's the Ondraw, and we're going to be drawing on a canvas. So we're going to be creating a canvas to put our skater onto. So I'll click OK, and then we have our override method for Ondraw for our canvas object. And now that we have a canvas, we can draw our bitmap onto it. So we're going to say canvas, which is coming from this. So canvas, and as soon as I hit the dot, I get a list of all the different methods that we can use with the canvas. So I'm going to choose draw bitmap, and there are a number of different options for draw bitmap, but I'm going to give it a draw bitmap, float left, float right. So the first thing is I'm going to tell it the name of the bitmap to draw. So we have Betty, which has been defined up here. So we're going to say Betty, and then the position where we want it to be. So I'm just going to feed it some values for coordinates. I'm just going to say 50 by 100. And then paint, we're not going to do any painting on this, so I'm going to set it for null. So I'm going to run this in the emulator. Since I'm not using any sensor information yet, we should be able to see what this will do in the emulator. All right, so there we have our little skateboarder drawn on the screen, all without using any of the layout files. So this is being drawn on the canvas. Now what I think I'd like to do is to set up my app so that it is in a landscape mode, so that when we do add the sensor information, she'll have more of a space in order to skate back and forth. So to set this up so that it will automatically load in landscape, we need to go into the manifest file, and we need to set up the activity so that it stays landscape. So I'm going to come into the main activity, and we're going to add Android screen orientation landscape. I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to run it in the emulator again. Okay, so now it is displaying that way. I just need to change it in my view so that the emulator actually changes to landscape. Okay, so we're making progress. Now we'll move on to setting up a sensor and a listener to see when this changes. Now we won't be able to test this from within our emulator, so the rest of this will have to be done on an actual device. Okay, so now that we have our skater appearing on the canvas on our screen, we're going to add a new class that's going to handle the sensor event. So we're going to listen for when there's a change in the accelerometer sensor, and then have our skater move across the screen according to the changes in the accelerometer. So I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to come over here and just right click and choose new class. All right, my class name, I'm going to call it Move Skater, and it's going to be an activity, so it's going to extend activity, and we'll click finish. And so we have our new class file called Move Skater that extends activity, and we're going to add on a little bit more here. It's also going to implement the sensor event listener. So I'm going to say implements, and so when I do that, I need to import sensor event listener, and then it highlights this and it says I need to add unimplemented methods. So I'll let it do the work for me. And we can see that two of the methods that are required are on accuracy changed and on sensor changed. So this is the one that we're going to be focusing on in this example, to be able to detect when there's a change in the sensor and then do something when that occurs. So in order to work with this, we're going to need to get access to some other elements, like we need our bitmap for our skater Betty, and then we also need a sensor manager that I'm going to call sensor or SM, and then we also need to access our draw skater class, and we're going to reference our view. And so I'm going to import all of these, Command-Shift-O or Control-Shift-O, depending on your system. And I'm going to switch over to the Draw Skater Java file, and we're going to modify this slightly. We're going to be using a surface view, and we're also going to need a surface holder. And the surface holder, import. So a surface view is just like a view, except it has some advantages for speeding up our rendering. So the surface view is something that's used quite a bit for gaming and animation. And the surface holder is responsible for controlling the surface and allowing you to draw on it from the time that it's created until it's destroyed. So the surface holder holds the surface, and so we're going to refer to that using our holder. And the only other thing I'm going to change on this is I'm going to come down and I'm going to comment out where we're drawing it to the screen. We want to hold off on that because we're going to let our Move Skater class handle that based on changes in the accelerometer. So I didn't want this to overwrite anything that might be going on through that class. And since I don't have the view anymore, I'm going to remove this unused import to get rid of that warning message. Okay, back to the Move Skater Java file. Now in the Move Skater class file, we're going to create a runnable thread in here so that it will be off of the main thread. So that will open up resources for our main part of the program in case there's something else it's working on as well. And we'll be able to set up our listener, our sensor listener, so that if there's a change in the sensor, then we'll redraw our bitmap on the screen and position it accordingly. So I'm going to paste in the code for the runnable. Okay, so I've added in the code for our draw skater. It's extending the surface view, and we're implementing a runnable so that we can have a separate running thread. And I'm going to import in all of these items at the same time so I don't have to go through item by item. Now I'm not going to go through and explain threads doing these runnables with the try and catch in here. That was covered in a separate video. So in this we're going to really focus on what's happening in the thread in order to listen for our sensor event and then do something based on a sensor event change. So what we're going to focus on in the runnable part is down here where we are actually running. So we're checking to see while it is running. So while that's true, we're checking to see if we have a surface holder, something on our canvas in order to be able to display a surface. So as long as that's valid, if it's not valid, it's going to continue, which means it's going to exit out of this loop. But while this is true, then we're going to go to the canvas and we're going to lock the canvas. In other words, we're going to make changes to it so nothing else in the program can make changes to it. And we're also, just so that we can see that something is happening before we start changing our image, we're also changing the canvas color to white. Now we're going to need to get some variables for X and Y coordinates for the position of our image, as well as X and Y coordinates for our sensor feedback information. So I'm going to come back up at the beginning and I'm going to put in some floats for X and Y and then sensor X and sensor Y. And then we'll come back down into the run section and we'll put in our bitmap. So we're going to draw our skater and we're going to say the position for X and Y is going to be sensor X and sensor Y. And again, this is for paint and we're not going to do anything to paint. We've locked the canvas so that nothing else can access it and make changes to it, and we're drawing our bitmap there. So then we want to unlock the canvas. Okay, now our activity, right? We extend activity and we don't have a onCreate set up yet. So to add an onCreate here, I'm going to move down so that I'm outside of this Draw Skater class. So I'm going to come down here right before my closing curly brace, and I'm going to right click and go into Source and choose Override Implement Methods. And I could type this in by hand as well, but I'm just going to have the computer do it for me. And I'm going to scroll down and find the onCreate bundle for it to add an override. So I'll click OK. So now I have my onCreate method set up. So when our Move Skater class is active, we want to check to see if the device has an accelerometer. Now most of the phones today have them, but we just want to be sure. So we just want to make sure that there is an accelerometer there. So we have our Sensor Manager class. We're going to say Get System Service because we can only have one of these running at a time, and our context is Sensor Service. And we're going to get a list of the sensors, and if the type accelerometer size is not equal to 0, then that means there is an accelerometer. We want to set up a sensor. So I'm going to create a sensor called S, and that's equal to our Sensor Manager type accelerometer, and we're going to get that sensor. And the other thing we want to do once we get the sensor is we need to register a listener so that it will listen for when there is a change. So I'm going to say Sensor Manager register listener. So we have Sensor Manager register listener for our sensor accelerometer, and the delay is normal. Okay, then the next part in here we're going to focus on is drawing our bitmap to the screen. Remember, in our Draw Skater class, we commented it out because it was putting it into exact position. But here we're going to control changing it based on our accelerometer data or feedback. So we're creating our bitmap image again with Bitmap Factory. Let me import that. And we're using the same terminology that we used before when we were drawing it to the canvas. And now we're saying our X and Y coordinates and sensor X and sensor Y coordinates, we're starting out to set it at 0. So we have our view, new Draw Skater with this context, so it's getting our Draw Skater class. And our view resume. And then we set our content view to our view, which is our Draw Skater. So next we need to set up the onSensor changed. That's going to be driving the movement or the changing of our skater. The onSensor changed method we're going to update. So I'm going to start by taking this out, and we're going to put in some values here. Sensor X and sensor Y. So this was one of the automatic methods that was added in that we had to override in because our activity implements the sensor event listener. So if you remember, the onAccuracy changed and onSensor change were required. So what's happening is on a sensor event, some information gets passed into this method, and it gets passed in as event. And what we're going to do is capture those values as event.values 0 and event.values 1. So we're saying the first value is going to be sensor X, so the point of X movement, and sensor Y, the point of Y movement. Now we can add in a little bit of a time delay because it is a very sensitive sensor. So we don't want to get every single movement or every single change. So let's do a thread sleep, and we'll do it for, let's try 20 frames in a second. And when I do that, it wants to try us to use a try and catch. So I'm just going to have it automatically put that in a try and catch format. And so this is almost all set up, and it looks like we still need to go in and set up the main Java in order to start the Move Skater event or the Move Skater activity. So what we'll do is set up an intent in here. So we'll say a new intent, and we'll import that in. So our context is this. So within our main activity, we want to go to the Move Skater class, and then we start our intent. So now if I try to test this on my actual device, let me see what happens. Okay, so when I test this on my device, I get an error message and it has to force close. So I think there's still something I need to set up in the manifest file. I believe I need to go in and set up the Move Skater activity, right? Yes, we have the main activity in here, but we add it in so that we have our Move Skater activity, and I've also got it set up so that it will be in landscape, just to make sure that it stays in landscape. So now let me save this, and I'm going to test it on my device. Okay, so the skater shows up and she is in the top left corner and moves just a little bit. Let me open up the DDMS and I'll grab a shot for you. All right, so it's right here and she moves just a little bit around. So I'm gonna let's go back into the code and see what we can do to remedy that. Okay, so as it turns out, when we're drawing the bitmap onto the canvas, this is just a slight movement. So what we can do in order to accentuate it or to make it more prevalent would be to take this and increase its value. So we could say multiply that times 10 and then multiply this times 10. And then when I test it, I get more movement from this, and I'll bring this up in the DDMS and see if we can try to capture some screenshots for you. And I'll move it in. Too bad it doesn't have like a video that we can capture from here. But, you know, as I move things around, she is changing positions on the screen. So with that, you can have some more to play around with and make adjustments. One other thing that we want to make sure that we do that's good form is that once we create a sensor listener event, we want to unregister that event. So we'll do that with an on pause. So we'll say our sensor manager will unregister the listener when the application is on pause. So a good place to go in to experiment with this would be with the X and Y coordinates. You can try changing the multiplication factor in here for a larger or a smaller change. And also, of course, this is getting the X and Y values that are changing. We could start the position of our skater in a certain place and then have it change by this. So maybe a quick example of that would be, let's say something like float start X 50, and then we'll do the same thing for Y, and then we'll say start X plus sensor X and start Y plus sensor Y. So if I run that, and I'll take a starting picture, right? So this is where it starts, and then as I tilt my tilt my phone, she moves from that point. Okay, so that's a demonstration, a very basic demonstration of using the accelerometer to move an image across your canvas.